Hey, how's it going, everybody? So, in the previous video, I awarded Auto Audio as the king of the chug, and it's true that it is still the king of the chug and the sickest metal amp sim for death metal and genty kind of stuff. But the only problem with this amp sim, for me personally, is that the chords are a little bit harsh sounding in the mid range, and I grew up on Fender tube amps, so it's pretty bad on the chords. But everything else is 10 out of 10 for this amp sim. So if you do death metal, brutal death metal stuff, and that's all you need, then just get Auto Audio. It's an amazing amp sim for that. But for me personally, I need something that can do chords and the death metal stuff. I need to be able to chug and also play a couple of chords here and there. So that's my needs, and it's actually probably a lot of people's needs out there too. They're not just going to be doing just chugs. But I started rethinking from the ground up. I need to readjust to make my guitar sound as best as possible, like tonally, without any clipping of static distortion or anything. And I realized that the spectral analyzer is a powerful tool because you can use it for setting your input level, your tube screamer if you're using one before going in, or like I'm using a compressor pedal. So you can use it to set your levels, and also once you start adding VSTs, it will tell you how much output gain you want to add. So the spectral analyzer is a very, very powerful tool for that. For instance, if I strike a chord and I don't have anything else on right now, I turned off the compressor pedal, the spectral analyzer will tell me how much input gain I'm allowed to add. And believe it or not, I'm on 0 and I've got it padded with no instrument on. So it's as low as my focus rate will go, and it's still spiking just above the line. So really, you need a lot less gain than like 0 gain for amp sims, because think of anything above that line, especially the really high spikes, it's going to represent static distortion. So now when I engage my compressor pedal, I'm going to notice what it does to it. And I've set everything according to the maximum amount of signal strength that I can get out of this pedal without going over the line. And it's a totally different way of using a pedal, because a lot of people, they just set it to their ear or what feels good when they play guitar. But this is actually a pretty intelligent way of doing it for amp sims, because it's going to tell you how much static distortion you're introducing into the signal, because that's all an amp sim does, is just take everything above the line and just crank it up to 10. And you want to control that and reduce that as much as possible, actually. So going into the amp sim. So yeah, that's how I set my compressor pedal and the input gain using the spectral analyzer. And then once you add, say, the Char booster, same thing. You always want to stay below the signal, and look how much input gain I'm using. Very little. You don't just crank it to the max. A lot of people instinctively just, knee-jerk, just want to crank it, and they're like, oh, cool, it sounds metal or whatever. But if I were to do that, you would hear so much static distortion, and the spectral analyzer would be terrible looking. So even when I engage the booster or a tube screamer, always keep in mind of the signal strength. Like, it's spiking just a little bit over the line, but that's okay. That's acceptable. So as long as it's around there. You can't control it completely. But now that you have that under control, then do the same thing with your amp sim, and adjust the level for the output. So yeah, after I did that really cleaned up the sound. I noticed that chords sounded a lot more pleasing to the ear, and it didn't have that kind of harshness to it. Because, scientifically, that's what I've done. I've kept the signal as clean as possible under the line here, the 0 dB line. So yeah, from there, I decided I wanted to use an amp sim that had a smooth distortion characteristic and chugs hard at the same time. So those are my basic criteria for what I need out of an amp sim. and the only thing that the auto audio didn't satisfy was the chords. That was the only thing it couldn't do. Everything else it was king at. So I started messing around with different amp sims, and I landed on TSC X50, and forgot to crank that up. But yeah, landed on TSC X50 and X30 and the Mega Fuzzy. Those three can do that sort of thing. And out of the three, I found that the X30 and the X50 are kind of tied. I can't really decide myself yet. I'm just going to have to play with them a little bit longer. But the Mega Fuzzy, for me, was third place because it had the same sort of problem as the Otto Audio, where it chugs super hard, good for death metal and brutal stuff. But then when you go to play chords, it just sounded too harsh in the mid-range and high-end. So that's the only problem with this one, and it kind of had a hollow mid-range that I couldn't really fix up, and I didn't want to touch my IR because that's another thing I did as well, is that I tweaked the IR so that it was what I needed for my guitar tone. Like when I just play without anything and just the IR, it sounds complementary to my guitar tone, and I've gotten rid of any of the honkiness over here. And this range is boosted, so it's nice and clear. And also, I want to mention I use rear gate. A lot of people, they use different noise gates and stuff like that, and that uses a lot of CPU. Like this is the best gate actually for that sort of thing. It uses like 0.1% CPU. And here's a tip on setting your level. You don't have to worry about any of this stuff. All you have to do is touch this one and set it so that when you place your palm on the strings, it gets rid of that, because then you're going to have really clean chugs when you stop, because that's basically the choke point. A lot of people, they'll set it like down there, and it's not quite tight enough. You want it, that's how you get that genty modern sound where it just stops clean after you chug. So yeah, I decided on the X30 and X50 with the Char booster the Nambriti audio. I think those sounded the coolest, because with this I can chug, and I can also do chords. Same with the X50 here. So yeah, that pretty much satisfies the ear for me. It's not quite as brutal and heavy as, say, this one or the Fluff one, but the cool thing about the TSC X30 and X50, actually the same thing, is that the CPU usage is super low, especially on the X30, because the interface is just nothing. But don't judge a book by its cover, because this is a brutal sounding amp sim. Actually, it works fine. And yeah, so that's the takeaway from this video, is become good friends with the spectral analyzer when you're setting your input level, if you're using a pedal when you're setting it going in. And you can also use the spectral analyzer for noticing if there's any white noise going on with your interface too. But pretty much set it at 0, because that's the cleanest source you can get for chords. Because it's easy to sound brutal, with the death metal stuff. That stuff's pretty easy to sound brutal with. You just turn up the gain or crank up certain levels. But in terms of sounding good for chords on amp sims, it's the hardest. That's definitely the harmonic distortion with amp sims is just horrible usually. So that's the one thing that everyone's tried to kind of resolve and fix. There's little tricks you can do with like chorus pedals and whammy pedals and stuff like that to kind of increase the natural harmonics. I've seen guys do, but yeah, that's really the trickiest part. But if you get the signal source clean from the get go, then the chords are at least going to sound clear to the ear without any kind of like piercing, shrill, or brittleness or staticiness to it. So yeah, that's the takeaway: is that get a spectral analyzer. If you don't have FabFilter, they're free. There's a bunch of free ones out there, and just make sure that when you're setting your levels, even when you're using AmSims and VSTs, put it at the end of the chain and just observe how everything increases the output level, and then you want to set it so it's below that, because don't worry about the volume initially. It might sound quieter, but you can always boost it with a Char booster or a limiter or whatever, like there's compressors. There's all kinds of things that can boost the sound afterwards. But so don't worry about the volume. That can be boosted afterwards. You want to make sure that the signal itself is clean. That's pretty much bang on. I'm right below it. So that means when I go to record multiple guitar tracks, say if I do quad tracking, it's going to sound really clear and very low fizz. And oh yeah, another thing I want to mention is when I set this is like the most important part of the IR right up here. I put it too. It's when you're setting the EQ right here. This is going to get rid of the fizz. So you want to fine tune it so that when you play a chord, it goes from like you hear like the bacon sizzle of like, and then you just kind of drag it over until you get rid of it. It's like, and it just goes away. And you want to kind of find the sweet spot though, because if you go too far and onto the left and reduce like too much of it, then it's just going to sound dark and kind of muddy. But if you find just the right sweet spot, that's the money. So you want to get rid of all that white noise though with a high cut filter, and just kind of boost this and cut this. This is kind of preferential, I guess. Depends on your guitar. But yeah, that's the basic takeaway for this video. Just use the spectral analyzer just to get a clean signal going in. And TSC X30 has a pretty smooth distortion characteristic. So does the X50. And so does the Mega Fluff as well. But, the only thing that sucks about the ML sound stuff in general is that the CPU usage is pretty high on them. So, you start getting little clips and dropouts and stuff. And because I don't have like the strongest computer in the world, it's just an i7 laptop Dell here. So it's 16 gigs RAM. It's not like a beast of a computer. So I have to consider that sort of thing when I'm running multiple tracks and stuff. And especially with my drums, if I'm going to be doing stuff with amp sims and my drums with the triggers, that's a lot of stress on my computer. So I have to keep the amp sims at a minimum with the CPU. And the X30 is fucking awesome at that, because out of all the amp sims, I did a shootout actually on what was the lowest. It was the RXG 100, but this was probably like third place actually. It was super low. THU was second, but this one was super good too. Look at that. Just 1% it got to. That's fucking awesome considering I'm running Reagate, TSC, and FabFilter all at once, and just under 1% it kept going. So that means that it's going to run smooth and steady. No clips or dropouts. And when I add multiple tracks of this, it's going to sound really smooth too. So yeah, man, that's the takeaway, is that if you want a really clean chords sound, use the spectral analyzer when you're setting your input levels and your pedals and your amp sim output levels and any sort of VSTs. Don't just crank things to the max and use your ear. You can always just raise the level afterwards. You want to keep the noise floor really low as possible, and also on interfaces in general, when you turn the gain down low, you're reducing the noise floor. It's just naturally how it works. Because if you turn up the level, you get hissing and crap in the mix. So yeah, that's it, man. Have a good one. Cheers.